Oh, letting some other folks in. Right. Okay. Let's get started here. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining me today for Introduction to Writing Foundation and Federal Grants. My name is Susanna Williams. And just so that you know, my approach with these trainings is to put quite a bit of content on each slide, simply because I want this to be a resource for you in the future. And you can refer back to these slides if you are preparing a grant application and want to look back at some of these examples and tips. So I do try to cram quite a bit on here for you all. I know you've worked with Innovative Funding Partners a bit, and just to give you a quick intro on us, we are a national grants consulting firm, and I would say that the unique thing about us is that we do try to take a really strategic approach with supporting clients in their grant applications. We do not just write a proposal and then throw it at 20 different funders and hope that one sticks. We really do try to think very clearly about the type of funder that would be best for each one of our clients and work on a proposal that is unique and that will stand out to each one. My name is Susanna Williams. I am a senior grants consultant with Innovative Funding Partners. I've been with the company for about 5 years. I have 20 years of professional writing experience, and 10 years of that is specifically for grant writing. In particular, I focus on federal grant development. I do have foundation experience, but I really love the complexity of federal grants, and I'm just a nerd who enjoys writing 60-page grant proposals to federal funding agencies. All right, so these are our learning objectives for today. I won't read them all out right now because we're going to go one by one through them. So let's start, and I think if everybody can mute, because I hear some feedback, that would be great. Thank you. So our first learning objective is understanding funding guidelines and assessing fit when you are looking for grant opportunities. All right, so for foundation opportunities, this is as opposed to federal or state opportunities. When you're looking at a foundation opportunity, the first thing you want to look for is what sector or discipline is the foundation interested in funding? Okay, that's your first factor to consider and see if you need to weed that one out. Foundations vary quite a bit in how specific their guidelines are. So I've included this screenshot here from the James G. Haynes Foundation website as an example of a funder that is very broad in what they will support. So they simply state that they're interested in projects that are in the arts, education, medicine, and environmental issues. If you are, however, going for something like Robert Wood Johnson or Hearst or Kellogg, they're going to be much more specific about the projects that they're interested in funding. So you always want to take a look at that. Next, you want to make sure you have a clear understanding of what geographic area they will consider. This has happened many a time where I've worked with a client who has said, well, this, we think this foundation is a good fit. And in going deeper into their website, we see, okay, well, for 2024, they're only funding in the Raleigh area, for example. So you always want to double check that a funder will fund in your specific area. Next, take a look at the typical grant award and really give this some thought about whether or not this is enough for the project that you're looking to fund. And finally, double check any exclusions. And this will quite literally sometimes be in fine print on an organization's website. So you always want to make sure that you've looked carefully to see if there are any exclusions, such as that they will not fund faith-based organizations, for example. Something that I always recommend for clients to do when they are considering applying to a foundation is to read everything on the website, not just all of the information under the grants specific tab or the how to apply tab. You want to go through their background, their history, their current priorities. You want to read everything that they have put out there, because this is your clue about how you want to structure your proposal and the kind of content that you want to include in your proposal. So for example, on the Kate B. Reynolds Charitable Trust website, this screenshotted page here, this is not part of their grants specific or how to apply tab. This is in their background and history web page. And from here, I see activating systems change, promoting innovation. And I know when I look at this, that somewhere in that proposal that I'm writing, I'm going to speak to how my project is activating systems change and how my project is innovative. So think about the information that you find from a foundation as clues to what you want to include in your proposal and what you want to highlight and speak to. Next, always take advantage of the fact if a foundation actually puts who they have funded in the past up on their website. So for example, the Leon Levine Foundation, they do post their grant recipients. And this is just a really good way for you to see what kind of organizations they have funded in the past. Sometimes, you'll recognize some of these names and you'll know something about that organization and know, oh, ours is about the same size as they are, or we're doing similar work. So it gives you a clue that, you'd be a good candidate. Sometimes you can find this information on a foundation's website, like in this case, but if they do not list this on their website, you can find this information through the foundation's 990. And how you do that is just create a free account through a website called GuideStar, and then you'll be able to search for the foundation, and then you'll be able to click on their most recent 990s. And as you scroll through that report, you will see a list of their grant recipients and how much each has gotten. So it's a good way to kind of see what they've actually funded. Now, we're pivoting into government opportunities, okay? Understanding funding guidelines for federal and state opportunities. For federal and state opportunities, you will have to receive and look through a notice of funding opportunity, which is what we refer to as a NOFO. All of the information that you need is in this NOFO. However, if you have any experience with these, you'll know that they range from 30 single space pages to 180 single space pages. So it is a ton of information. And what I want to do here right now is give you some tips about what sections to look at first to save yourself time so that you are not wading through 150 pages. So first off, in the first few pages of the NOFO, you will find a section that's called something like Program Funding Description or Overview. And this is where the funding agency will describe the purpose and the goals of this particular program. That's what you first want to look to understand, okay, is this along the lines of what we want to do? If it is, keep going. You're going to pass go and go to eligibility. So for government opportunities, eligibility can be very complex. You want to pay close attention to this section. They may tell you things like, you need to have 3 partners. You need to have a consortium of 4 different partners, and one of them has to be a healthcare provider. Okay, so they're going to give you some very specific eligibility requirements, and make sure you meet every single one, or you will waste your time with this particular opportunity. Next, go to the application or submission information section, and this will tell you how you would actually be submitting the proposal. So for example, it will tell you that they're receiving applications through grants.gov, for example. Okay, now this is a little tip that I tell our clients. Usually in the NOFO, there will be a long section on how what the project narrative requires. Okay, all of the different questions that you'll have to answer. And rather than go through that, which is typically quite long, you can skip ahead to the review criteria section. This offers you a more condensed iteration of those narrative requirements. You can go through it more quickly. And in that criteria, you will find some specifics about what sorts of programs or projects they're looking for. And again, it can kind of serve as a checklist for you. It's just a shorter way than having to read through the entire project narrative requirements. Next, look at the award information, because this will tell you some really important information, such as the projected date of award. This is important because, say, this opportunity, you will not find out for 9 months. That may be way too far out for you to apply. You may need those funds sooner. So this is always important to find out in the NOFO. Finally, the appendices. Don't skip over these. Look for key definitions in this section. We often refer to this, for example, when we are trying to see how a particular funding agency defines historically marginalized populations, for example. We have often had to see if that term for a specific agency includes, for example, rural and low-income populations, in addition to BIPOC populations. So again, look at those key definitions to get a grip on what the funding agency considers certain terms to mean. Let's talk about vetting an opportunity. All right. So this recaptures what I've just discussed in terms of making sure that you meet all of these different things, that you are eligible, that your idea is closely aligned to the purpose of the funding program, that the timeline that you would need to implement your project is well aligned to the timeline that the agency wants you to do this in. So for example, your project really would be best if you had a 2-year timeline, but this particular grant opportunity may only be for a 1-year time frame. So again, got to make sure that you can do it in the time frame they want you to. Next, you want to think about, is the award amount sufficient for what you need? And also consider what you would be able to bring to the table in terms of in-kind support. What I always recommend, if a client has a project that basically has checked all of the boxes and the only issue is that the award amount is just a little too low for what they want to do, always think about, is there a way to scale our project down? Could we serve fewer people in this time frame, or could we serve a smaller service area and still be able to apply for this funding? Because when you have found something that matches everything other than that award amount, think about whether you'd be able to implement it on a smaller scale. And finally, think about your capacity. It can be, very exciting to see a grant opportunity that seems to be right up your alley. You would get, $300,000. But think about, if you actually get that award, do you have the staffing? Do you have the resources to implement the project? This is just a little do and don't that we give our clients about being proactive while avoiding a scarcity mentality. So when you find an opportunity that's well matched to your work, your goals, your budget, your capacity, go for it. It can be very intimidating to apply for a federal grant for the first time, but in any funding program, at least one, usually many more than one, of the awardees, it's their first federal grant. So there's always got to be a first time, so don't let that hold you back. However, you don't want to waste your time and your resources pursuing an opportunity that you're going to have to do all kinds of gymnastics in order to try to cram what you actually want to do into the requirements of this particular opportunity, okay? You should wait for a better fit. Federal and state grants take a lot of time to develop, a lot of manpower, and you want to actually be pursuing one that is well aligned to what you want to do, not applying for funds that you'd have to then create this whole other separate program. It's not going to offset your staffing costs. It's just this whole other thing just so that you can get this grant funding. All right, key differences between foundation and government grant proposals. So both government and foundation proposals have each of these elements that I'm going to talk about now, but they're to different degrees. So a compelling story with an emotional hook, that is something that we tend to emphasize for a foundation proposal more so than a government proposal. A foundation proposal really needs to have a persuasive quality that is based, it has a strong human element. Okay, we want to tell a story. We want to convince through story. Whereas responding to each and every requirement in order and in a very prescribed manner, that is more government proposals. Of course, you are going to respond to every question in a foundation proposal, but you typically have a lot more leeway in the way that you answer questions and in the information you present than you do in a government proposal. To talk a little bit more about the role of story in foundation proposals, we always say that grant proposals to foundations must not only inform, but also inspire. Remember that you're writing for a real person, okay, typically the program officer or a board member, and they're going through a stack of proposals. You want yours to stand out. You want them to be captivated by what you're saying. So we do this through story. And for example, a typical story that we might tell is a before and after for a person or community that is served by your work. So we may say, we may describe the circumstances or the issues that this person or community are facing, and then how their lives are changed through the work that we do. And just remember that, of course, you want to include data in your foundation proposal, but that what is going to stick with that program officer more is that story. So the role of story in government proposals, of course, you do want to be convincing and persuasive in a government proposal, but you generally have to tell your story through very specific and detailed data that they tell you to include. You're appealing more logically than you are emotionally in a government proposal. And unfortunately, you could tell the best story in the world, the most compelling story in the world in a government proposal. But if you miss a few requirements, you're not going to get funded. So those requirements are really paramount in a government proposal. So these are some stylistic differences between foundation and government grants. Here I have an excerpt from the James G. Haynes Foundation application, and you can see that obviously there are specific questions, but they're quite broad. So what is the scope and purpose of the project? Obviously, you're going to need to respond to that, but what information you include and how you respond is largely up to you. Versus, here is an excerpt from a Department of Labor, Building Pathways to Infrastructure Jobs. With the Department of Labor, they refer to their NOFOs as RFAs, typically, requests for applications. And I've included this as an example to show you that this is just a couple of requirements within this one section that's only worth 4 points. But you can see that it is very detailed as to what you have to include. And although this does look very intimidating, I always try to tell our clients that the good thing is you don't have to guess. They're telling you exactly what they want. So that's sometimes kind of nice that you don't have to guess what would be the most powerful way to answer this question. So here in this next part, I have included some examples from successful proposals that we have written to demonstrate some tips in style that we typically use. For government grants, we always use the exact phrasing that is in the NOFO in our response, and we use some formatting techniques to make sure to really call that out. So The purpose of this is to make it as easy as possible for the reviewer to go down their checklist and find all of the information that they're supposed to assess. So as they go down their checklist, they're going to be saying, okay, so where did they answer geographic characteristics? Well, here it is. Where did they talk about the demographics and income? Right here. Where did they talk about the needs and assets? Right here. So we typically use this kind of formatting and bolding to be able to guide the reviewer through our proposal. And of course, if you have the space to make paragraph breaks here, that's what we do too. But here we had such a tight page limit that we kind of had to put everything together and separate it through this bolding. So some content differences between foundation and government grants. For both, you want to demonstrate that you have done your research, that you've fully immersed yourself in understanding the funder that you're applying to. And you can do this in different ways for a foundation versus a government proposal. For a foundation proposal, you're going to want to, as I mentioned earlier, read everything you can that's available on the website. Read their up-to-date mission statement, their funding priorities, annual reports, research any recently funded projects. And when you're writing your proposal, you don't want to parrot back the language of the foundation, in that you don't want to embed their mission statement in your proposal, but you do want to call out specifically how your work drives their priorities further, okay? Now, for a government proposal, a way to do this is to go to the program purpose or program description section of the NOFO. That's that first part that I mentioned earlier that you should take a look at when you're assessing eligibility. And take some exact language from these sections to weave them into your goals and objectives. Because unlike with a foundation where they're going to want to see you present yourself a bit more creatively, with a government proposal, they want to make sure that you definitely understand what the goals are of their program. And another technique to really get a leg up in a government proposal, in that program description section of the NOFO in the beginning, you will usually find that the agency will include some footnotes, or they will refer you to some links that take you to some, recent legislation, some reports, speaking about relevant information about this particular opportunity. And we always recommend, read those too. And you can reference them in the proposal. And it really demonstrates to the reviewer that you've gone the extra mile to find out some more tangential, relevant information to this proposal. Key considerations when you're developing a foundation versus a government proposal. When it's a foundation proposal, it's all about the mission, okay? You are focusing on your project's alignment with that funder's mission, and you're focusing on how your work is going to advance their vision, okay? That's the key thing you want to get across in your proposal. Now, a key consideration when you're developing a government proposal, however, is looking internally and thinking about your own administrative and fiscal capacity. Okay, you want to think about what kind of accounting system do we have in place? Are we able to track grant funds separately from non-grant funds? What about data collection? Because with government grants, you are typically going to have to do some more complex reporting than you would with a foundation grant. So how do you collect data currently is something you'll need to consider. To talk a little bit more about data collection and reporting for government grants, here's an example of some indicators, some performance indicators for a Department of Labor grant. And this is, again, an opportunity where applicants knew that they would have to report on each of these elements were they to receive the grant. And this is great because you can know, all right, so how would we track that? Do we have the setup to track this data? So you always want to consider when you're developing a government proposal, what sort of capacity do you have for data collection and analysis? Do you have a staff person who has any evaluation experience? Sometimes, depending on the government grant opportunity, they will allow you to request specific funding to pay for an evaluator. An external evaluator is what it is called. And this is because with some opportunities, the data collection can be very complex, and the government agency is aware that a nonprofit organization might not have the capacity to handle that kind of data collection and evaluation. So you can sometimes request funding for that. Next, we are going to go through the overview of a typical grant structure, and this is similar across foundation and government grants. So both foundation and government grants will have a need section. It is called various things, and a foundation application may not even have a separate section necessarily, but somewhere in that proposal, you're going to have to speak to the why of your project. In a government proposal, it is often called the need section. For both, it's your chance to tell the story of your community, your target population, and or your work as an organization. Here is an example of just a 1/2 page of a need section in a federal proposal. And I'm including this to show you that, again, you often have to include some very specific data that you can get from online sources in a government needs section. So here we have some narrative about health insurance coverage in the area. This proposal was for a multi-county service area, so we had quite a few tables like this in order to present the information that was required. Now, on the other side, for a foundation proposal, here I have included this as an example. This proposal was on behalf of a charter school in the Asheville area that served BIPOC students. And here you can see that within a pretty slim character count, we tried to tell a story while also weaving in some specific data. So here is our opportunity in only 2,000 characters to try to really convince the program officer with a story. And again, I include all this information on the slides, knowing that you can't read it all as I'm going through, but that I want you to be able to refer back to it as an example when you are writing an application. So next up is our project description or methodology section. This is the how of your project, okay, or the what that you're doing. Often in government proposals, it is called methodology, but in a foundation proposal, it may be, describe your project or project description or goals and objectives. The crux of this section for government or foundation proposals is stating and describing your goals and objectives. Now, goals and objectives are these two terms that are sometimes really tough to differentiate between and wrap your head around. So we are going to take a deep dive right now into the difference between goals and objectives. So a goal is a broad statement about an ultimate outcome from your program. Goals are describing the behavior or the condition in the target population that is expected to change. It's a big picture statement, okay? So a goal is not a, single step. It's a big picture change. It should align with the grant purpose and with your statement of need. We do it in one sentence if at all possible. And usually we start a goal with a word like increase or improve. And I've included this example as a way to show you how you can strengthen a goal, okay? Because if you look at the goal here on the left, increase the capacity of the local employment services agency to support opportunity youth, it seems like it meets what I just discussed, okay? It's got increase, it's a broad statement. We're talking about what is increasing, the behavior or the capacity. And it seems like a good goal, right? But on this side, you can see that we've added some detail just to make it more specific. It's still talking about a broad change, but we've narrowed it a little bit so that the reviewer understands exactly what we're trying to do. So instead of just talking about increasing the capacity of the agency to support Opportunity Youth, we're going to say that we're doing that to increase the capacity of the agency to provide training to Opportunity Youth, okay? So we narrow it down from just so that they can support the youth to so that they can provide training to the youth that will allow Opportunity Youth to secure employment through registered apprenticeships. So again, we made it more specific while still talking about kind of the broad change that we're attempting to effect. So again, what's the difference between goals and objectives? The goal is the long-term result, all right? The objectives describe the specific steps and the manner in which they will be achieved, all of these things that have to happen in order to achieve that long-term goal. So here is a specific example. Our goal is this broad statement of improving food security, but we do make it specific in terms of who are we talking about? The historically marginalized populations in Falls City. And we're stating how we're going to do it. We're going to increase access to fresh food and SNAP enrollment services. And we even squeeze in here where, okay, at 3 food pantry locations. Now, in order to achieve this broad goal of improving food security, all right, our objectives are our specific steps that we are going to take in order to achieve that broad goal. So our first objective is that we will provide a 5-day intensive training to 3 full-time food pantry coordinators. Okay, these are the people who are going to be enrolling the historically marginalized individuals in fresh food access and SNAP enrollment. Then objective 2, we're going to implement a new data management system because we need that if we're going to be able to track the data indicators for providing food support. And then thirdly, we are going to actually provide the fresh food to at least 300 individuals, with at least 150 of these individuals completing 4 encounters over the project period. Once we have done each one of these objectives, we feel confident that we're going to be able to say that we improved food security. All right? Something you're going to see a lot, if you have not already, is that many foundations and pretty much all government funders are going to ask you to make your objectives SMART, all right? And what does SMART mean? Specific, measurable, achievable and accountable, realistic, and timely. We're going to go through each one of these elements with a couple of examples, okay? Some of this is self-explanatory, like specific. Measurable, I want you to know, means that it's quantifiable. And so in general, you've got to put a number on it. All right. And then when we're talking about achievable and realistic, just know that, you always want to underestimate rather than overestimate your ability. So if you think maybe you could serve 200 people, you're not going to want to put that. You're going to want to put the number that you definitely can serve. Okay. So maybe that's 150 instead of 200. What you never want to do is put yourself in a position where you have to go to your program officer and say, I think we overestimated and we're only going to be able to do this instead. Okay. Obviously, if that happens, it happens, but set yourself up for success. And when we say timely, another word that we use for that is time bound. So we're always going to say when we're going to accomplish these things by. So let's take a look at a couple of examples here. Both of these are SMART objectives. The first one, we've got by the end of year 3. So what element is that? That's our time bound or timely element. All right. So we're saying exactly when we will have achieved this by. The clinical psychologist will provide behavioral health services, including cognitive behavioral health therapy. So here we have been very specific, right? We're saying who is doing this, and we're saying what, providing behavioral health services. We take it a step further and we say exactly what type of behavioral health services, CBT. Okay, and now here to at least 50 incarcerated individuals, there is your measurable. All right, we're saying exactly how many. It's also for this particular applicant was their achievable number, okay, with substance use disorder. Next up, I include this objective in this training to show you how, some of this feels like jumping through hoops, and sometimes it is, but here's a way to jump through this hoop when you need to include something and you're thinking, how do I make that measurable? So for this one, we needed to include this really key objective that the consortium was going to finalize data sharing agreements with 12 partners, and this was key to us being able to say we've achieved this goal. Okay, so the way that we do that is you can say within the first 60 days of grant award, the consortium will finalize data sharing agreements with 100% of project partners. Okay, so we've put a number on it. We've made it measurable and quantifiable for an objective that might seem like, how do we make that measurable and quantifiable? Like I just said, sometimes this can feel like jumping through hoops, but it's for a good reason. Funders want to see SMART objectives because that's the basis of evaluation. Okay, at the end of this project period, they want to know, how did you spend the money and what effect did it have? Okay, we can use these SMART objectives to determine the impact of your project and the impact of their grant funding. If you are receiving foundation funding, well, they're going to have to report up to their board about, okay, this $100,000 award we made, this is what they did, okay? And you can't say that in just a broad statement. You need some actual measurable outcomes to be able to report. With the government agency, they've got to report up too, obviously. And they need to be able to say, this applicant took this $500,000 and here are the measurable outcomes from their work. So it is important. Another key aspect of project design, and this goes for both foundation and government proposals, although it typically is much more important in a government proposal, is evidence-based practices. This is a term that can feel a little opaque, but basically evidence-based practices are you telling the reviewer that you've done some research and you have studied the evidence base, which means you have seen what kind of similar projects are out there to what you are proposing to do. You can see what does the scientific history show us about those projects? What were the outcomes? Are there peer-reviewed journal articles that support your project design or that have some of the elements of your project? And what kind of impact did those projects have on the target population? This is some technical language on what evidence-based practice is, but it's essentially using the best available research, okay, to help guide what your work and what you're doing, saying that you're not just operating in a vacuum and doing things you think will work, saying that your approach is rooted in good evidence. So why do you want to use evidence-based practices in your project design, and how do they make your proposal competitive? It shows the funder that you're well-versed in the issue, okay, that you have thought about what others have done in the past to address this issue, maybe in a different target population, but still you've researched different approaches. It also means that, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. If you have studied up on this particular issue in your population, and you've found that in a different state, a nonprofit took this approach and it was highly successful, you can borrow some of the elements from their project design and embed them in yours. And you can say, this was proven to work in Minnesota. Also, just by studying programs that have successfully implemented evidence-based practices, you can also get a clue as to what you can include in a proposal for your performance measures. So in the section where you are writing about evaluation or your measurable outcomes. I often, if I have a really complex healthcare proposal, and I, for example, am writing about a diabetes education program, well, I'll research the peer-reviewed journal articles through, Google Scholar, and I will go to their results section of that peer-reviewed journal article and see, well, what did they report on? What outcomes did they report on? and get ideas for what the client can report on. So I may see in a project, in a journal article, that this particular program, they measured A1C3 levels at 3 months post-program, at 6 months post-program, and at a year post-program. And I can say, okay, well, that seems like a good idea, and include that in my proposal. So again, it can give you great ideas too, just doing your research. This is an example, again, that you can refer back to later, but this is an example of weaving in reference to evidence-based practices in a proposal. This is a foundation proposal, and again, we had a very small character count requirement. So here I am just trying to ground the applicant's approach to closing the achievement gap among BIPOC students in an urban charter school, trying to anchor it in the evidence-based best practices. So by reading various current reports, by reading journal articles, I highlighted some key interventional techniques like addressing factors that are occurring even before instruction begins, like having access to healthy foods, having access to free uniforms. And this example is meant to just kind of show you how you can do this in a way that, I'm not a scientist, certainly, but I can read some of what has been published and relate it back to the work that this applicant is doing. Another tool to support project design is the logic model. Now, I would say that it's pretty uncommon to have to include a logic model in a foundation application. And usually I would say maybe 40 to 50% of the time, we need to include a logic model in a federal proposal, in a government proposal. But I think the logic model is actually a really great way to do some program planning or project design as a team. So I want to kind of take you through a little bit about a logic model. These are the key elements of a logic model. We have resources and inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and impact. And the reason that I think that this can be a really great tool for project design is that it really helps give some structure to, for example, if you have a 5-person team and you want to sit down and discuss, okay, what do we want to do with this program? How do we want to structure this intervention? And by using a logic model template, it really helps direct the discussion in a productive way rather than everybody just kind of sharing what comes to mind and bringing up this point and that point. If you kind of help everyone walk through their ideas through a logic model, it just lends some structure. So we always say work backwards. So we usually recommend that you start with, okay, what's your long-term impact that you're trying to have here through this particular project or through this work? And then we ask, okay, what specific outcomes would we be looking for? This might be, increased knowledge or a changed behavior, basically. Now, an output is just a straight up measurement, whereas an outcome is talking about changes in knowledge, attitudes, beliefs, behaviors. Outputs are more like, for example, if your activity is provide training to Opportunity Youth, your output would be number of youth who received the training, whereas your outcome would be number of students reporting increased knowledge of X, Y, or Z. So then you would go into your activities. What are the key things you're going to do through this program? And finally, your resources or inputs. What do you need in order to do the activities? And just to add about your inputs, your resources, those can be material or non-material. So it could be specific curriculum that you would need. It could be specific funding. It could be staff time. Basically anything that you need in order to do those activities. With a logic model, you want it to pass an if-then test. And that's just a good way to think about how you're putting your logic model together. You want to ask yourself, if we use these resources and inputs and do these activities, will we achieve these outcomes? Just so you know, sometimes a logic model might have short-term outcomes, medium-term outcomes, long-term outcomes, but you can also just keep it very simple and just have outcomes. For each activity, you want to ask why it's being done. Is it necessary? And you want to look at your logic model and say, are there any logical gaps here? Like, we're expecting students to demonstrate increased knowledge on this subject, but are our activities sufficient for that? Do we need another activity to ensure that they're actually going to demonstrate that? So again, using that if-then framework is a good way to think about it. This is a basic successful logic model. So this shows you just, a few activities, a few outputs. They have divided their outcomes into short, medium, and long-term outcomes. But again, you don't have to necessarily do that. It sort of depends on the exact program, whether or not that makes sense. But again, these two columns, this is your planned work, okay, what you're planning on doing. Whereas outputs, outcomes, and impact, that's your intended results, okay? So just to show you very quickly, the inputs here are their budget, it's staff, and then staff people, okay, who are actually going to be doing these three activities. And like I mentioned earlier, what's an output? Well, it's this specific measurable outcome from an activity. So that would be, for this, provide alcohol and other drug screening sessions. What's the output then? 250 screening sessions. Now, your outcomes, like I mentioned earlier, though, are changes in knowledge, beliefs, attitudes, behaviors. So here, the reason they split these up into short, medium, and long-term outcomes is because for the short term, they wanted students to learn protective behavioral strategies. In the medium term, they wanted students to actually use these strategies. And that will eventually achieve what they hope is a long-term impact or long-term outcome. And that's the rates of the negative impacts of drinking in the student population decrease. Whenever you're thinking about an impact, or sometimes called a long-term outcome, that is something that cannot be measured right away, right? Okay, we cannot measure the rates of the negative impacts of drinking in the student population within a couple of months. That's something we'll have to measure in a year or 2 or 3. Okay, so again, looking out farther in the future. Here is another example. This is a more intermediate logic model for supporting college aspirations among low-income youth. And again, here are our intended results in the outputs, outcomes, and impacts. Here is our planned work. All right, we need each one of these inputs in order to achieve these three activities. Then I have here, notice that there's a logical link between each activity and its output. Okay, so we want to train staff to deliver college workshops. So here our output is number of staff trained. And here the activities recruit low-income youth to the program. Number of program participants recruited and served. All right, whereas the outcomes are talking about changes in knowledge. So here we have an increase in the students' knowledge about the college application process, all of which eventually, farther out from now, are going to achieve these long-term impacts of increasing low-income students' high school graduation rates. And again, we can't measure that in the near future. It's going to take us some time. All right, best practices in grant proposal development. I'm just going to go through these very quickly and try to leave a little time for questions. We always recommend taking a team approach to a foundation or government proposal, but certainly with a government proposal, because they tend to be very complex and can sometimes require 100 hours or more of work. So we try to always have a program manager or project manager, a narrative writer. That would be the person who's actually writing the narrative content, like the program description, the methodology, etc. And then we also try to assign a separate budget person or non-narrative person. Always submit your deadline and make it earlier than the actual deadline. So many things can come up in a grant application process, and if you plan to submit on the day that it's due, the chance that something is going to come up and sabotage your actual submission is just too high. So we always recommend try to submit at least a day early, but we typically try to submit a few days early. We really recommend creating a project timeline that has specific deadlines for different stages of the project, and I'm going to show you. These are the elements of the project timeline that we try to incorporate. We always try to include time for review. So if you, for example, you need to make sure that your executive director has time to review the application or your board has time to review the application, build that into your timeline. Submit a deadline that is early and stick to the timeline. Here is a sample project timeline. When we are actually working on a project, instead of having just IFP here, we'll have IFP hyphen Susanna. Okay, we'll assign an actual person to each task or activity. You can refer to the timeline throughout the development process so that nobody has to be the bad guy and be hounding anybody. You can say, taking a look at our timeline, it looks like our line item budget draft is due tomorrow. So whoever it is who's responsible for this, Rachel, please make sure that you have that to us tomorrow. Okay, it just helps serve as a springboard for the whole team, keep everyone on task without anybody having to kind of be the one who's after everybody to do these things. You always want to loop in your subject matter experts, which is just a fancy term for the people who would actually be implementing the project on the ground where you awarded. You want to make sure that what you're proposing to do in this application makes sense, so that if you're describing a referral process, you need to talk to the people who are actually going to be doing that referral process to make sure that you can implement it the way that you are describing it. Partners, this is really key. Always approach your partners right from the get-go. So if you know that you need to loop in 3 partners on a project and they maybe need to contribute a letter of support, you want to approach them early, like first week that you're working on this application. I would say that probably the number one thing that holds us up when we're trying to submit an application is waiting for partners to provide information or letters of support. Everybody is busy, and if they're the ones who are not actually directly working on it, it's not going to be their highest priority. So that's just a general tip for expediency. All right, so I know I covered a ton of information, and I hope that you can use these slides as a reference and go back to kind of maybe read them in a bit more detail, but just wanted to ask if anybody has any questions.
Just thank you, Susanna, for sharing this very detailed PowerPoint. I was very informative, and I did take a lot of notes down, and I wish we'll be implementing into our team.
Great.
I did have one question.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think is the best practice model, or I don't know if that's the proper word, but if our team is, an administrative side, 2 people, what would be best to, like, the end of this PowerPoint, you had like the timeline of things like that.
Mm-hmm.
What would be best so that we could implement this into the organization?
So I would definitely recommend in that case with a small team, just have one person drafting the narrative content, because it can get a little tricky if you're trying to split it up between 2 people, where then you have to kind of go back and adjust like the voice, if there's a different tone across 2 different writers. So I'd have one person do the narrative writing and one person manage everything else. So the budget, assembling the different, other requirements like your financial statements, any letters of support, because typically that narrative writer, that's going to take, just about as much time as doing all of those other attachments and budget, et cetera. So I'd split it up that way. And of course, then, you exchange your drafts, or you would review what each of you has done, like the narrative person looks at the budget and the attachments, the budget and attachments person reviews the narrative, and work together that way. That would be my recommendation.
Awesome. Thank you.
Any other questions? And of course, if anything comes up, comes to mind, when you go through the slides and you have another question, you can always reach out to us. I'm happy to answer anything else. Okay, well, if there are no more questions, I will stop recording, and thank you all so much. And I wish you the best of luck with pursuing funding. It can be an exhausting process, but it's well worth it. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, take care. Thank you all.